I have a 3-year-old. He has fun doing everything. He has fun getting in the shower. He has fun pooping. He has fun doing everything. And it's
I have fun pooping too, Frank.
Oh, who doesn't?
That's not a 3-year-old thing.
That one hurt. You gotta drink more water, buddy.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Mathews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie.
Ian, you son of a bitch.
Yeah, but at least I'm not a quitter.
Yet.
Yet. So I've tried to quit a few times. We are getting knee deep in quitting today, and it's fascinating. As we prepared for this episode, we started to put our outline together, and we were thinking about this topic. And without even knowing it, before we even got into the episode, Frank and I, we typically spend like 30 minutes just talking about what's going on in both of our businesses before we even get into the podcast. And the topic on both of our sides this morning had everything to do with some stuff that we needed to quit doing. And specifically to business. I'm not talking about Frank eating too many pita chips or something of that nature. We're talking about really business. And one of the things Frank was asking me about is, would I want to come and give a keynote at one of his masterminds? And I kind of hemmed and hawed and delayed it a little bit and said, I'm not sure. And, the more I got into it, it wasn't so much that I didn't want to do it. It was a trade-off of my time of other things that are going on, because next year, I just know in 2022, I'm going to have far less discretionary time to do things like that. And I think the more we got into it, you started talking about some coaches you're working with, and you're going to have to kind of figure out how to change your focus in 2022, which means spending more time in some areas and quitting some other things.
So I'm no gardener, and I'm not somebody who's really good with a lot of, I don't have a green thumb by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the things that happens in a lot of instances, like when I bought my newest house, the landscaper came out and he just literally scalped everything to a point where that's hideous. And I asked him, I was like, why? He's like, I'm going to cut back these trees aggressively because they haven't been properly maintained. And if I cut them back aggressively, what you're going to see is they're going to grow and they're going to thrive. But if I didn't do anything with them, what they would do is eventually get rotted. Something might fall off. A branch could come out, like it could get struck by lightning. There's a bunch of things. And it's an analogy that ever since it happened in my backyard, kind of unbeknownst to me with someone else making the decisions, I've used it in business. And I always say, hey, maybe this is time to either, to pick the low hanging fruit or to prune the tree. And you can only grow. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so much energy you have, and you can only grow in so many ways. And sometimes it really makes sense to prune the tree because it's best for growth.
And I think we're going to talk about quitting on this call because we've both done our share of quitting. But I think the misnomer most of the time is that successful people never quit, and that it just doesn't happen. They just grind their way to everything. And the truth is, just about everyone successful has quit something to go follow something more important.
It's a tired trope, honestly.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that follows you from childhood of don't quit, quitters never succeed. But the most successful people in the world have quit multiple things. The people who are the most successful, most of them billionaires, have all quit college. Now, that doesn't work for the lion's share of us. It doesn't work for me, but it worked for them because they're so much smarter than it wasn't benefiting them. But so I think it's important to kind of interject that.
And there's, I think there's some famous examples that we can start with and talk about, and all of them are for a little bit different reasons. So as Frankie and I were just brainstorming on people that we think about when we think of quitting something where it was shocking that they quit because it seemed like, well, they had everything, right? They were at the top of the world. Dave Chappelle is one where it was a resounding yes. Chappelle had just signed a $50 million deal for his show. It was, it had kind of moved from being a cult classic to mainstream. It was, everyone knew Dave Chappelle and Chappelle's show. So when he quit, it was really shocking. And it was alarming because people loved his show. They really looked forward to seeing more. So it wasn't just alarming. It was, I think his fans were sad and frustrated, angry, upset, because here's a guy at his absolute peak. And Chappelle's reasons for quitting, he didn't come out with them right away. He just went away. He got quiet and it went dark, and he just went and moved back to Ohio. And it took him a while to really talk about it. But his big thing was he had become bigger than he was comfortable with. You know, he had a show that used to, use satire to explain racial stereotypes. And it got to a point where he thought his show was reinforcing racial stereotypes. And, he talks to Letterman about a moment in his show where they were doing a skit, and, it had heavy racial undertones in it. But at a point in the skit, folks on the set laughed at a point that he didn't think was the funny part. And it kind of made him feel like he was the clown. He was the ass of the joke, and that they weren't laughing with him. They were laughing at him. And it made him, he said he felt terrible shame, and it made him really think about, what does this show become? So very early in a $50 million run, Chappelle just left and lost all that money. They took it back. He didn't fulfill his contractual obligation. A lot of people thought he was crazy. And here we are 10 years later, Frankie, and he's absolutely bigger than he's ever been because he had the guts to go do something like that. It's kind of made him a legend in the industry, that he's above being owned.
Yeah. And we've talked about this here. I'm sure this is the place where all of you come for news. But his most recent special, he was kind of like flying in the face of cancel culture. And he said it on there, like, I don't give a shit if you cancel me. I've canceled myself. Like, what can you do to me? It's like the Eminem moment in 8 Mile. Like, what can you do to me that I haven't already done to myself? So it's one of those things. But when you were saying something about Dave Chappelle, I actually thought of something. When I was growing my business, we were growing pretty quickly. And this was probably 3 years ago. And I remember we were bringing somebody on and I got scared. Like I did. I didn't talk to you about it. I certainly didn't say it to my staff. I was like, remember thinking like, am I growing too fast? And that person ultimately didn't start. Something came up. They didn't it was a weird thing. Like something in my gut was like, this is wrong. But I remember thinking about that at that moment and being somewhat scared. And it was honest. Like, I'd never grown a business like that. Now I own 300 houses, and like, I got a text message last night from someone. This happens to Ian and me. Like, hey, I think you're a beast. I want to work for you, or I want to do something with you. We're just people. We get scared too. And like, I get freaked out. And like, some people go, they're no Frank Cava. Like, I don't think I'm that special. Like, I'm just doing something repetitively over and over, and it's had a great result. But like, I think at the highest level, someone like Dave Chappelle was like, I'm losing track of my life. And I think one of the things we're going to talk about, Ian, in this is it's the 21st century. We all got cell phones. Technology is different than it's ever been. We are in a place where you get to choose and pick. Life doesn't just have to get dictated to you. You have resources at your fingertips, and you could be as famous as Dave Chappelle, and you can say, you know what, this just isn't it for me.
Chappelle left because he felt like he was selling out. He felt like his purpose was wrong. It had steered off track. You take someone like Garth Brooks, who at his peak was the biggest star in music, period, not just country music. He was the biggest star, and he just walked off the face of the map, just walked off.
Before you get into reasons why he walked off, I want to put this in perspective. He was such a big star. He hadn't played baseball since middle school. He was 50 pounds overweight. And for 5 years in a row, baseball teams let him come to spring training. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
He literally used to get to go to spring training. Like,
Yeah.
he has no earthly right in the world to be taking batting practice. Like, your son is a better hitter, but Garth Brooks can sing better. So he got to go to spring training.
Garth was the man, but you know, his reason for leaving, his why, we're going to get into the whys of quitting, but you know, Garth Brooks had all the money, the fame, everything in the world. It was just more. So it was, you know, a little bit for him was he had kids. He wasn't spending enough time with them. And so the trade-off for him to continue down that life and what he was missing wasn't worth it for him. So he chose to go spend more time with his family, to go spend his time different. Cause that was, when you have all the money in the world, the only thing you can't buy more of is time. It's the only thing you can't buy more of. And he had all the money in the world, and yet his time was being used by other people. And so that's why he chose to do something, you know, different. You know, you want to talk about the REM drummer?
When Garth Brooks came back, he won Entertainer of the Year like 2 times in a row. Like, he immediately was back where he was, and he did it on his terms. And it was pretty incredible, but it was very courageous to walk away. The REM drummer, like, most of you probably don't even know who REM is, number one. And number two, who the drummer is probably completely inconsequential. But his name is Bill Berry. And one of my favorite bands growing up was REM. And somewhere in the mid to late 90s, he had an aneurysm and like fell over on stage. And he literally fell over on stage. They postponed the tour. They got him, you know, vertical and back into a place where he could play the drums. They finished the tour, and he stepped away from the band, and ultimately he retired. Now, 20 something years later, he's come back and played a handful of gigs, but he was no longer their drummer until they, you know, discontinued as a band. And what he decided was, I'm happiest when I'm in Georgia and I'm on my tractor. Like, I've been behind this drum set for 20, 30 years. It's enough. And REM was the band. Like, they were one of the absolute hottest band at the end of the 90s. And he did not partake. He just walked away because he had a scare. That scare woke him up. And with that scare, he decided to refocus his life.
In the news recently was Simone Biles, Olympic gold medalist. And her reason, I think, it's multifaceted, but a lot of it was mental health. I think so much pressure on that young lady. She just, you know, she was a superstar in the previous Olympics, won everything, and was being hyped as the greatest gymnast of all time. So I've thought about her a lot. Michael Phelps had the same issues. That was a no-win situation. I mean, you are expected to go in and win 4 or 5 gold medals, and anything less, you failed. And you're up against the greatest in the world at what you do, even if you're that good, man, that's pretty tough to kind of go through some of that. But her even bigger issue is she got what's called in gymnastics, the twisties, where in midair, you kind of lose track of where you're at. And it's incredibly dangerous to not know where you're at when you're spinning 18 times in midair, the way that girl can fly. So she stepped away, and a lot of people were pissed off. And really, I think this theme is going to go through this whole episode. All these pissed off, outraged people of, you're a quitter and you turned your back on your country. Really, who gives a shit what any of them say? Like, we all live our own lives. And if you live it based on what other people may or may not say about you, you're not going to end up being happy. So to me, I was not outraged. I was not on the camp of, I can't believe it. It's the friggin' Olympics. It is not, give me a break. It's a big corporate bamboozle for people to make money in advertising. If she didn't feel like taking part, well, then who gives a damn?
So what I think is hysterical is I can't find it. I just thought of it while you're talking about her, but there was a meme I saw, and it was something to the effect of, all y'all on social media are saying Simone Biles is a quitter, and you can't even wear a damn mask when you go to the grocery store.
So God bless her. She made a decision for her. And I think we want to talk a lot about these kind of things. You know, I'm a Detroit Lions fan. I talk about it a lot. Barry Sanders broke my heart when he retired because he did it kind of at what felt like he was still at his prime and his peak. He just had rushed for 1,700 yards the year before, was a candidate for MVP and just walked away. But his quote has always resonated with me, Frankie. It has always resonated. And Barry didn't talk much either. He was a little bit like Chappelle. He just kind of went quiet. But he said in his little, and he released it at the like an Oklahoma newspaper. He didn't even announce it with ESPN or something big. He just said, my desire to quit is now greater than my desire to play. And I just think it is so beautiful, that line. It is so simple. And yet it just kind of cuts through all the clutter of, you know, why people get themselves caught up with sunk costs and all these things. Barry's answer is very honest. It's just, I want to quit more than I want to play. That's, and you guys don't have to like that. You don't have to love my decision, but it's my decision and I'm going to live with it the rest of my life and I'm good with it.
Well, Ian was tasking me with coming up with some names on this. We were trying to think of people who weren't just in sports, right? So Chappelle popped up there, which we thought was a good one. The REM drummer, I remember reading that, being young enough, being like, it just doesn't make sense to me. But I was in my 20s and I had my health, so I never had anything like that. As I'm in my late 40s, I'm kind of like, I get it, like things hurt more. But the best example I could think about of someone who was quitting was George Washington. Hopefully they're still teaching that in school. He was the first president of the United States. I don't know if that's been replaced by the Underground Railroad. But the point is George Washington was in charge of this incredible republic. And we had term limits of 4 years, but we didn't have maximum amount of terms. And so he had a 4-year term, but it didn't say he had to end after 4 years. And he goes, you know what, I think 2 is enough. And the King of England, who we had just defeated 8 to 10 years earlier, was like, that is some kind of a man who would walk away from all of that power. And I think what George Washington was saying is, this place is bigger than me. And the person who we just left and fought to leave in England is saying, how could someone do that? Like, wow, what a man. But you think about what that's done. It's loosely defined if you can serve a 3rd term, and some people try to push it, and they've made amendments after the fact. But the point is, like, he didn't have that amendment in place at that time, and he just thought, this is it. This has been a good run. This is a good time to walk away. And if you've ever read about him or you've ever seen that incredible series called John Adams, like John Adams gets up and like is this incredible orator. And George Washington wasn't as loud of a speaker. He was a huge man, but he was not as loud of a speaker. And it's incredible what he did by making that decision to step away. Is he set a tone for a place where it made a lot of sense. And until, you know, FDR in World War II, nobody had ever challenged it.
And, you know, Washington's a good example too, because George is a pretty simple dude. He wasn't a real politician. He was voted in because he was a great general and he was an incredible leader, great warrior, great leader, but he didn't necessarily like the politics. He didn't necessarily like the office. He didn't like the decisions he had to make on a regular basis. He was uncomfortable in that job from day one and thought there would be better people to do the next step. And so, you know, so many reasons it's cool that he stepped away. But again, it comes back to, he didn't think that position was serving him anymore either. I mean, wasn't having the best time. He did it out of duty for his country and mission, all that, but he didn't think it served him a little. But I think, Frankie, you talked a little bit about how, you know, you grow up with this quitters never win, and quitting equates to failure and weakness and dropping your dream. And, you know, I think both of our parents were pretty similar, you know, and I think they're similar to all American parents, which is if you start something, finish it. And I don't know. I feel like that still makes sense. So myself as a parent, I'm kind of that way on team sports, because I think if you quit a team sport in the season, that leaves your teammates in a bad position, that leaves your coach in a bad position, that leaves other people in bad positions. I think it's completely silly when it comes to individual activities. You know, something where you don't impact anyone else if you quit. And I think most things in life are usually along that line of, it doesn't really impact other people much if you quit. But if you do have some team things, I do kind of think that's not the right thing. I had, my son played tackle football for the first time, and August tackle football is the worst. It's 2-hour practices and 100 degrees, and you're hitting for the first time. And if I'd have given him a chance anytime in those first 3 weeks of practice to quit, he would have taken it in a second. But this was not a discussion. You started this, you signed up, you are going to finish the season. And it's a great life lesson for him. His team came together. They did really well. They won a little county championship. Great lesson for him to learn. But if I would have let him, he would have quit. But that to me, I still kind of feel strongly on some of that stuff with teams, where if you're really letting someone down, you should probably stick it out as long as you can, at least until they're in a good place to move.
So what I think it is I think it's a parenting trope, right? Like, you don't want to quit. I'm not going to raise a quitter. Like these things, right? And I think at its core, I haven't gotten to this place yet where my kids have discretionary decision making. Like, they basically do what they're told. They're 3 and 8 months old. That's it. It's like, you're going to do what we tell you. And that's kind of what it goes down to. But I think the reason that this quitters never win is still in our parlance and still used regularly, it has a lot to do with the fact that parents don't want their kids to have momentum or inertia going in the wrong direction. So what you hear is you shouldn't quit. You should never quit. I'm not a quitter, right? And it makes sense, because when you're 3, when you're 6, when you're 5, whatever, when you're a young kid, you just don't want momentum in the direction of, I'm quitting. This is a quitter. I can start and I cannot finish. So I think there's a good lesson for a period of time. But I also think there comes a time when you need to look at things and you need to say, does this serve me anymore? And I think we're going to talk a lot about this later, but I'll give you the best example for me. I dated a woman starting when I was 27, and I broke up with her when I was 35. I knew it was the wrong relationship 10 months in. And I was in that relationship for years. And I was doing it because I thought I could make it better. I thought it was okay. I didn't want to quit it. And at the end,
and the longer it went, the more sunk cost you had into it.
Right. And at the end, I remember we broke up, and there was a lot of just nasty words and feelings. It didn't work. There was nothing catastrophic. It's just, it was a wrong relationship for both of us. But I remember telling a friend of mine, and not like one of my core friends, just a friend, I wasted 8 years of her life. He looked at me and goes, you wasted 8 years of yours too. And I had never thought about that. I had never allowed that to get into my head, that I also had sunk cost and lost time. I was 27 when it started. I was 35 when it ended. That's real. And it's one of the things that has changed me, is realizing I didn't get that time back. Now I look at things like Ian and I look at. I have a very successful business. I'm not going to quit the business, but there are parts of the business that I may or may not keep. And I ask myself as a business owner all the time, does this serve us? Is this sensible? Is this where we should be spending our energy, our money, our capital? Would we be better suited repositioning? Like, those are good questions to ask. And that isn't quitting, that's evolving. And that is a very different thing.
So you said something about just pretty much forward momentum. Is a big reason why we do that. We know we have enough data to say that your odds of succeeding in life are better if you finish the 5th grade than if you get tired of your teacher and quit halfway through. So that's a pretty obvious one. But we kind of know, the material they're teaching in 5th grade is stuff you're going to need. Probably good for you to stick this thing out one more year. We know better than you as a parent. Just like we know that if you make it through a baseball season and you didn't like your coach and you finish it out, you're probably going to be proud of yourself for finishing it out. There's a lot of data that goes around there. I'd say the same thing about high school. Your chances in life are dramatically higher if you finish high school than if you drop out early. But I think it starts to, after high school, starts to get a lot more blurry. Does making your kid finish college mean they're going to be more successful than if they were to quit their sophomore year and go start a business? Some of these things, the times have changed so much since the 50s, 60s, 70s. I think there was a time where getting a college degree absolutely gave you a huge advantage over someone else, but now comes with a lot of debt, doesn't come with a lot of promises of more income. I don't know that it translates the same level as it used to. And so, some of those things that you learn as a youngster of quitting or sticking through things in the business world, absolutely nothing is guaranteed. There's nothing like fifth grade. If you just finish everything you do in business has an uncertain conclusion that you're hoping for, especially if you start something. But even which company you choose, which job you choose, should I stay in this job long enough? I'm in sales. If I take this marketing approach, will it work? Everything's uncertain. And so to have this mindset of, if I've started it, I have to finish it. When does that end and who gains?
Yeah, and I'm looking something up while you're talking, Ian, because there's a book called Tightrope. And Tightrope is about how it's kind of in the same spirit of hillbilly elegy or dope sick. And it talks about like how much on the razor's edge people live with their finances. And what it talks about, there's three things. I can only recall two of them. I could look it up, but the three things were finishing high school and not getting pregnant before you finished high school. Like those are two of the things that, like, if you check one of those two things off the list, like you don't finish high school, and God forbid you don't finish high school, and you either get someone pregnant or you're pregnant before that, like those are two things that just put you behind the eight ball is the best way to put it. From a financial standpoint, it's very hard to recover from. But once you get to a certain age, and especially if you have a certain amount of gumption, there is a world out there where it doesn't necessarily make sense to just keep pushing through college. And my dad went to a high school that was called Tech. It was technical institution. He never went to college, but what they did at Tech is my dad, they taught him about electrical trade. He was already doing it with my granddad. And not only did they teach him about the technical trade, like when he was a junior, he was able to leave like midday and go to work and work on his trade. And it served him very well. He's had a great career in life. And I think that's some of the things we get away from, is we want to push everybody into this 4-year college experience, where sometimes that isn't a sensible move. And it's not the right thing for people. And I think as a society, we've gotten away from that. And I mean, it makes sense, right? Colleges are big businesses.
So I think about things that I've quit, and when I've wanted to quit, when I haven't. I think there's some times where quitting is definitely not okay. I mean, we've obviously touched on a couple of the obvious ones, but just because something is hard, I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people quit too early, and their issue is more just impatience. They try something, it doesn't work, so obviously I'm not good at this. I'm going to try something else. And the truth is, anything worth having is going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take a bunch of embarrassing setbacks and mistakes and miscues. That's just normal. If you want to learn how to golf, you're going to hit a bunch of balls in the woods before you get good at dropping it on the green. I think the part that I struggle with, I think everyone struggles with, is how much time do I give this before I just realize I'm not good at it and I'm never going to like it? You can't start everything and put 10,000 hours in. You can't Malcolm Gladwell everything. You just can't. You have to kind of choose which things you really dive deep in to become expert in, or is it just something I'm going to delegate for life, something I'm just never going to really want to do a lot of?
Yeah. I don't really have much to add to that on that part, right? Like, you got to gut certain things out. And I think that comes down to parenting. And then I think you have to be confident when you have the ability to make decisions, or your child has the ability to make decisions. You have to be comfortable there to allow them to make them. But what I want to pivot to quickly is when it is okay to quit. And it pivots with this, Ian, when it's not, right? Like I had a mentor early in my career. He was someone that I met when I was still in college. I flew up to NVR. He figured out before me and showed me the roadmap of come and work here. You build yourself a house. You can trade that house into another house, do it 2 or 3 times, you make $1 million. It was not an original idea that I had. I copied somebody else who did it. And this person meant a lot to me. And I was unhappy at NVR in 2004. And one of the things that he told me in 2004 was, if you quit now, you'll be fine. But if you quit in 5 years, you're going to be great. And I was like, well, why so? He's like, because in 5 years, you're going to go from being where you are as a production manager to most likely running a division. And if you're a vice president with a publicly traded company, it's a lot different spot than if you're simply a middle manager. The world is going to open up to you in different ways because you are going to see things in very different ways than you do now. And there is a statistic out there that people who start their businesses in their 50s, 40s, 30s, and 20s, and I did it in that order on purpose. The older you are when you start a business, at about 60, it inverts. But in your 50s, 40s, 30s, you are way more likely to succeed as a business owner than you are if you start something in your 20s and your 30s. And the reason for it is you have more experience and you have more money. So if you wait and grind and do these things, it gives you a much better chance of being successful long-term because you waited. It wasn't because it was just hard or I disliked it. You set yourself up and it becomes positioning. You're not quitting, you're positioning.
So, I think when you say quitting not okay there, I think the lesson learned there is leaving NVR too early wouldn't have served you because you wouldn't have got as much out of NVR as NVR got out of you. Because when you're young in a company, and especially if you're with a good company, the company's going to take everything it can from you. It's going to let you work 80-hour weeks. It's going to let you grind, do twice the work of a normal person because you're ambitious. But it takes a while to really get the full value of a great company. And that comes with just learning, that comes with the experience, the responsibility they give you, the decisions you make, and getting to be there long enough to see, did my decisions, were they fruitful or did I make mistakes? If you're just there for a short period of time, how do you know if any of your decisions were worth a damn? You weren't there long enough to see them out. You were kind of getting moved all over the place. So I think that's pretty insightful to think about, is if you work for a great company and you're thinking about, should I quit, go work for another company, start my own thing? I think ask yourself, does the company still have more to give me? Can I still grow here? Can I still learn? And how much more valuable? And when Frank says leaving as a project manager versus leaving as a division manager, the value of those two things is not 20%. It's 3, 4, 5x what he was making 5 years before. And so you have to ask yourself, would another year, would another 3 years, would another 5 years in what I could attain at this company, what kind of multiples of income could I make if I stuck it out and got that extra experience? And not just would someone hire me, because yes, that's important. Your resume will look better if you have different positions. But if I were to go work for that company, how much more valuable would I be because of the experience and the stuff I've learned, the skills I've gained by sticking it out?
And what I learned in that 5 years, I went from a production manager to a sales manager, to a general manager, to a division manager. And I was a division manager for 2.5 years before I ultimately quit. So had I stayed another 5, I probably would not have gotten promoted again. Like, you don't get promoted out of a division manager role in less than somewhere between 7 and 12 years on the norm, right? So if I stayed there another 5 years, I would have been doing the same stuff. Now, would I have been better? Perhaps. Would I have had more money? Yes. But would I have any really new skills? And the answer to that for me was no. I think I could have gotten better with some of the skills that I have, but I had had all the exposures already. I had developed land, I had built things, I had hired, I had recruited. when it came down to it, I was like, okay, this doesn't make me happy. I can continue to be on the gravy train, but I have the skill set. And I remember 10 years later when Ian called me up, he's like, I'm thinking of quitting. We had the very similar conversation of, all right, you've been in that role for so much time. What's next? He goes, more people, more responsibility, more travel. It's not exciting. There's nothing new. I'm not growing. It's just more money.
It's just more of the same, more. It's like Garth Brooks, more concerts, more tours, international now. I'm flying more. It's more money, bigger record albums. That's all it is. And if that's all it is, and you're not excited about, now, if you're excited about those things, awesome. I'm sure there was a point in time where Garth was like, I'm going to Japan. This is amazing. But like the 5th time going to Japan, he was like, Jesus, I can't believe I'm going to Japan again. Like, what a pain in the ass for me. It gets to that place where you're just not excited. You're not enthused. So it's a lot of people think quitting's not okay because you're going to let the team down. So I've already talked about, as kids, we don't want to let a team down. You don't want to quit the soccer team in the middle of the year because that leaves them in a bad place. And that's true. But there's also not another soccer team you can go join. You're not getting paid. You did that. You made that commitment. I think it's a little bit different when you work because you're a free agent. Every day that you work, you get paid for, and the company pays you for your services. There are no long-term contracts. And to an extent, no matter when you leave a company or quit a job or stop doing something, there are going to be people inconvenienced, period. Like, no matter, there was no time for me leaving GE or NVR where it was not going to be a pain in the ass for a while. I was doing a lot of work. That meant a lot of that now fell on my boss's shoulders. A lot of it actually fell on the managers underneath me, who were already overwhelmed. And now they were having to do a lot of things that I used to do. The company had to find my replacement. There were some people that maybe left because they didn't like the new leadership. So it inconvenienced the company for a while. But after a few months, everyone gets used to it. Like, there's almost no position anywhere where if you leave, the company's in dire straits for years, and all of the people left in the team are usually, the group figures out how to handle what you were doing and they move on. And I think it's a big reason why most people don't quit companies is they give too much of a weighting of how bad they're leaving their company and how inconvenienced everyone's going to be. And a lot of that's just ego. You think you're more important than you are.
So I remember quitting my job January of 2009, and it's going to be hard for me to articulate this in a way, but it's this, Ian. I remember I didn't sleep. Remember I quit, and I went and got a Starbucks, and it was early. It was really early. It was 5, 6 in the morning. Like, nobody was on job sites yet. And I remember driving job sites, and I remember seeing a heater. It's January. It's cold in Virginia. I remember seeing a heater in a house. The heater in the house means the heater's on, so the drywall all the mud and everything dries on the drywall. And I had quit, and the drywall heater was still going because at some point in the not too distant future, the drywallers were going to show up. They were going to move the heater, and then they were going to sand that house, and then they were going to paint it, and that house was going to get finished. And it didn't matter if I sat in that chair anymore or not. And it was the world moves on without you. And we tell ourselves these bullshit stories. And sometimes you tell yourself these bullshit stories when you're a little kid because you need to get through football practice. But at some point, it's just like, you know what? Everyone else is going to be fine. Let's focus on me a little bit. And there's a fine line with that. Like, there is.
So let's talk about when it is okay to quit. I think first is when it's just clear you're no longer wanted. I think that should be pretty obvious, but a lot of people do stick around much longer than that. But I think that's one of the most miserable times you should stay at a place is when it's clear that you're not wanted.
So I'll tell a story about this. I have a friend who worked for, not as a friend like myself, but I have a friend who worked for a company, and they were pretty high up within that company. And they did so at a young age, and they did very well. They're very well thought of, and almost to a point where they were like, they were small equity owners in a small company, but it was a big deal. Like they were kind of an owner and were treated as such. And the management team that really owned the company, the majority stakeholders, sold to somebody else. And this person decided to hang around for a long time. And there was a bunch of employees who were there, but this person was the last person. Then all of a sudden, like the job was gone. They were told they no longer had a job, and it came as a surprise. And as an outsider looking in, my opinion was they've been telling you for years they wanted you to go do something else. You came from the old regime. You weren't like there were signs. So what ended up happening is this person walked in and got fired and has to pick up the pieces. Where what could have happened is you could have looked at it and said, you know what? I'm going to look at this objectively and realize what happened. I've seen this in books and stories and movies. When something gets purchased, the only thing that's usually left is the basket of money the owners got, and everybody else has got to fend for themselves. And so in some instances, you got to look at that and be honest and you know what? I need to be selfish and I need to go prioritize me and figure out where the right spot is for me.
The nature of business is you can be the most important person in a company today and next week not be wanted. And that's really hard for people to grapple with. But your story resonates with me. I saw it happen. I was only at GE for 6 years, Frank, but I went through 3 reorganizations, which are largely like acquisitions. When a big company reorganizes, all that means is a bigger part of the company takes over a smaller part of the company, and those managers have all the power. And the whole point of reorganizing is to wipe out layers of management, layers of, redundant accountants, redundant analysts. But every time it happened, managers who were like gods in my little business, all of a sudden were very clearly not wanted. And some of them didn't know how to handle it. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't see it. And I was a kid and I could see it, like, wow, you have no power anymore. Like the new managers talk over you in meetings. You're not invited to some meetings that I'm going to. It's pretty clear. And some of them would just, like your friend, hang around and hope that power dynamic would change. But no, it's not going to change. Like that happened. That sucks. That happened. It's not the same company you thought it was. And some people that I knew were really talented, and they were more talented than the group that came in and took over. They left. They were like, screw it. If I'm not wanted, I'll go somewhere else. And there were no hard feelings. And our business kept rolling right along without these talented people. It wasn't as fun for me when that happened, but they saw it. They could read it right out of the gate. We've reorganized. You can call it whatever you want. I'm not wanted the way I was a week ago. I'm going to take steps to protect myself and my family. There's a new regime. I'm going to go find somewhere else to work rather than waiting, having this contentious, relationship for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And one day you finally just having the guts to say, I want you out. Or you just say, you know what? I can see it right now. I'm not as wanted as I was before, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to start looking for what's next for me right now while you're paying me. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. And the thing that I would challenge anybody who finds himself in this situation is most likely you're not really passionate about it either. You're staying there because of fear. How do I pay the bills? How do I put my kids through college? How do I do this? How do I do that? You're thinking it from the capitalistic aspect of it. It most likely no longer serves you either. You're bored. You're not really into it as much. You're kind of just doing it out of routine. And I wasn't at GE with Ian, but I was at NVR, and I watched the same thing happen with a couple of different mergers. And you saw people who were the most important people who weren't, and some fought it, and some were like, you know what, I'm going to mercifully just sit on the sword. I'm going to say, this has been a good run. And some instances, I've done this before, where I have someone who's not the right fit. And instead of bringing them in and being like, look, I'm going to just lop your head off, I'll ask, hey, don't you feel like I feel like this isn't really working? Doesn't it make sense to be proactive? How do I, as an employer, help you get to a place where it could make sense for you? And that's a good spot to be, I think, and that's a good dialogue to have with somebody, but it sucks. But it's one of those things where you get to kind of refocus and reevaluate.
And listen, if your gut tells you something just changed dramatically, maybe someone got promoted into a position of power that's over your boss or your boss's boss, and it feels immediately like things have changed. I don't think this individual wants me anymore. You should listen to your gut. Because speaking of someone, for 20 years, Frank, I was fortunate. I was promoted a lot of times over businesses. And if I made you feel that way, it's because I did feel that way. It wasn't by accident if I made you feel like you were no longer wanted.
Correct.
There were times where I was promoted into positions to make big changes in a company. When I was promoted into positions, almost every time it was because something was failing, and the boss that put me in charge of it said, go make changes and fix it. And I'd already been watching that business. I knew how it operated. I was in maybe a sister business, or I was a peer to the person that was running it before. I kind of knew who was doing the job there and who wasn't doing the job. I had a strong opinion at every job I came into. And if I didn't have an opinion of you right away, I usually made one within 30
Pretty quick.
days.
Yeah.
I needed about a half hour to an hour with you, looking at some of your numbers and then talking to you directly to kind of form an opinion. And if you ever felt like you weren't wanted, it was intentional. And so you should trust your gut. You should trust your gut, because a new manager comes in, they can't just go wipe out the whole staff. They're going to do it piecemeal over time. They're going to go after the most obvious actors, but over time, they're going to get the people they want in place. And if you're feeling like you're not going to be one of those people, you should probably act on it to protect your self-interest.
So there's two sides of this, right? There's people who were the sacred cows before, who were absolutely loved and adored by the previous regime. And those people will sometimes, I would say it's two camps. I always assumed when there was somebody new coming in, they were going to try and push me out. But they didn't usually push me out. What they did instead is they embraced me. And they let me know, like, oh, this guy's like, I had that conversation with the new manager and I impressed him. They're like, we want to keep this guy. And I felt it. And I felt it quickly, because a new manager needs someone really good under them who supports the mission, who's on board, who's producing. So you need that. The other side is I was one of the sacred cows, and now I no longer am. But there's a third group who is often overlooked. And it's the person who is actually talented, but for some reason, the previous regime missed. That happens. So there's a fresh look at things. And they're like, you know what, this person has been pushed aside, but I see reason to not push this person aside and to empower them. You can think of it all the time in sports, like all the time. It usually happens through injury, and they promote somebody, and then that guy, like Tom Brady, got promoted when someone else above him was the highest paid payer, and they never gave the job back. But it happens in business too, because the new manager looks at you and says, I can work with this guy or girl. I can help them. They can help me. So those things happen too. So it's not like there's new manager just run out, but think about where you are. And if you're not being embraced in those first 30 days, this is probably coming.
I think an obvious, though, time when it's okay to quit is just when you're doing something that no longer serves you. And I think using the word quit in general is probably a mistake, that's the name of this episode, I guess, but our lives change, our responsibilities change. My life in 2012 is different than it was in 17, is different than it is going to be in 2022. So there are lots of things that I've done in the past that I enjoy doing, and I don't consider them to be mistakes. And I don't really consider that quitting. I don't look at it as a negative thing. I just no longer do them. I no longer have time to do certain things that I used to do. And now I have other things that are filling my time up. And I think if it doesn't serve you, it doesn't make you happy, if you're not excited about it, find something else to do. That's not just career. That's everything. That's everything. Don't keep doing something. If running is making your hips hurt and your knee, and you got to get surgery because you were running in your 20s and now in your 40s running the same distance, and you just keep doing it because you're not a quitter, in my opinion, that's ignorant. Go swim, learn a different, get into Pilates, do something different. Don't, your life is different. Don't keep doing something just because you're not a quitter.
Evolve. I think it's part of that. It's not quit, evolve. So I want to say something else about what you're talking about no longer serving you, right? So we had a person who worked here. He no longer works here. He was, I don't know, mid-20s when he started. He was going to school to get a degree in accounting. He was doing entry-level data entry for us. I knew he had an expiration date on him. I knew it. When he graduated from college, 6 weeks later, he came back and goes, hey, this has been a great run. I love the company. I got to try something else. That's why I got the degree. Okay. Like, I get it. That made sense. Like, he was making moves. He worked. He deserved what we paid him. And, but it was one of those things where it was like, he's not a lifer in that role. We've done a good enough job as a business where he's told me point blank, like, hey, maybe there'll be a chance in the future. I really like it here. Maybe I come back. I can live with that. But that's also part of it. So like, as the person who's in the role, you need to realize like, it may be best for you to leave. And as the person who's the owner, you're not signing people up for life sentences. I live and work in Virginia. It's a right to work state. People can come, people can go. That's just part of life. Like, your team's going to change over time. And sometimes you want to see people go, sometimes you don't, but it's part of life.
Well said, man. Well said. I also think, there's times where you're doing something that is fine, that's working well for you, that's paying you well, that you're good at, that you think is okay, but you have an opportunity to do something that gets you much more excited. And I think really this kind of gets into regrets a little bit of, I'm doing something that's safe, that's working, but in 10 years, am I going to look back and say, I wish I would have taken that swing? And I think if that's the case, if you really feel like I'm going to regret not trying this one day, I think that's a beautiful time to quit. Especially if you ask yourself, if quitting and trying this new thing doesn't work, could I find something comparable to what I'm doing a few years from now? If the answer is yes to that, I think all day long, quitting is a good idea. I think it makes sense, or at least changing, switching your time to something different. I think that makes sense all day.
Yeah, it's so let's flip to the opposite side of this for a second. Let's talk about building a culture where people don't want to quit. So I feel like we have a pretty good culture at our company. I feel like we have pretty great retention. There was a period where nobody quit, like we fired people, but there was like 3 years where nobody quit. So it's a good culture. It's a good company. It's a good place to be. So what we try and focus on is you, your career, your goals, what you're interested in. Are you bought in? And as we get bigger as a company, we do other stuff. We have community service events now. We do community outreach. We attract a lot of younger people to work here. Giving back is big for them. Being a part of something that's bigger than themselves is part of the thing a lot of the people who we're recruiting are into. Nicely, it lines up with my core values. But those are things that we try and build is a culture where you don't want to quit, a culture where you want to grow, a culture where you're challenged. People quit for a bunch of reasons. Money is usually fifth. It's usually not feeling challenged, not being wanted, not feeling enriched, not feeling like you're growing. So those are the type of things that as an employer, you want to make sure you have, so your employee base is continuing to strive.
And I mean, we're talking about all the times it's okay to quit. We're talking about when you're not happy, when you're not motivated, when you're not stretched, when you're not growing. And so if you're a manager and you're a company and you want to keep employees, don't let that happen to people. Show them a career path. One thing I think you do better than anything, forget planting trees. You have a very clear success path. You have entry-level jobs. You have second-level jobs, third-level jobs. If I start for Frank and I'm good at what I do, I can see the next 2 or 3 jobs ahead of me if I want to go earn them. I think that is more important than anything else you do, is you give people a chance to grow, to not stagnate, to not be bored, to when we talk about making people more valuable, if I start at Cava companies, 5 years later, I'm worth dramatically more than when I started as an entry-level person. That I think we can say that unequivocally. If you started at an entry-level, lower paid position in your job, and you made it through 5 years and you took some multiple promotions, you are way more valuable to the next company that hires you, or you are closer to starting your own thing and being more responsible than beforehand. And that's why you retain people.
Or you're migrating into a role that retains you here because you're continuing to be challenged and you're continuing to grow and you're continuing to get better. And I'll ask this often, several times a year, by a show of hands, who wants to be doing the exact same thing in 2 years? Nobody raises their hand. That's not
ever.
No, I don't want to be doing the same thing in 2 years. I want to be evolving.
Even people that do will raise their hand. Even people that are like, I'm actually pretty cool where I'm at. I find people raise their hand just from the social pressure of I should be growing, because we're taught that as kids, our parents always moving forward. And then you go to promote someone and they're like, I just kind of raised my hand because everyone else was. There's this social pressure of I should always be advancing, that everyone in your family, your friends, everyone is pushing you for it.
But there is a way to not change jobs or change positions within the same company and evolve, to do new things, to get better, to become more efficient. Those things are rewarded and those things become fun. So you guys know this. I have a 3-year-old. He has fun doing everything. He has fun getting in the shower. He has fun pooping. He has fun doing everything. And it's
I have fun pooping too, Frank.
Oh, who doesn't?
That's not a 3-year-old thing.
That would hurt. You gotta drink more water, buddy. But the point is, like, he's always doing stuff that is mundane. Getting dressed, he laughs. Getting into the shower, he giggles. He runs around. He makes it fun. Going to bed, he runs laps up and down the hallway. And what we can learn from 3-year-olds is they figure out how to make shit entertaining. And if you're in this rut and you're thinking about it, maybe it's you. Maybe there's a way to make things entertaining so you don't have to quit. But if it goes through this list of things we've talked about above, maybe it is the right time.
But I think a lot of people, when you see people that are jumping around and looking at things right now, look, people are throwing money at people, signing bonuses, all these kind of things. If you're in a place where you feel like you're growing every day, you're getting better, there's opportunities to take bigger jobs, and you leave for just a incremental pay raise, you're a moron. Unless that company can also offer the exact same skill growth and opportunity growth, especially if you're younger, you should be thinking hard about how am I making myself more marketable, and not 5, 10, 15% more marketable. How am I making myself 3, 4, 5 times more valuable to someone who would hire me? And if your company can give you those things, quitting is silly. Suck it up, eat ramen noodles. But if that company is making you more valuable, you have to understand what the long game is.
You and I have talked about this early in the history of this podcast about something very similar. And it's like, sometimes you got to embrace the suck. The suck is like, if you're in your 20s, it's going to suck. Like, you're not doing the great jobs because you're learning the skill set that gives you the ability to do the more fun stuff. And that's just true. I mean, unless you're Zuckerberg or somebody like that and you can build something, for most of us, there's a process. So this is kind of funny. And I was at a family wedding a couple of months ago, and I shipped up a bunch of wine in like June. And I was there with my family, and I was like, this is going to last my uncle like months. And we had enough people there where we drank it in minutes. So I called my uncle. I said, hey, we're going to have this wedding. I'm going to send you up some more wine. And he's like, cool. I was like, just drink it. He's like, no. I'm going to wait for you. We're going to do a wine tasting. And what was funny about it is my cousin that got married was 27. And one of the people who was there was a bunch of, she's a woman. There's a bunch of her friends, girls, women, 27 years old. And when you have know-how in wine, people immediately just assume you're rich. It's hysterical, but like, you understand wine, like, oh, you're rich. You're done better than me. And like several of them asked me, they're like, how did you get to a point where you had money? Is basically what they're getting at. I'm like, your 20s suck. Like, you're not supposed to have this in your 20s. Like, it doesn't happen that way. It happens if you do all the right stuff in your 20s and your 30s that give you an opportunity in your 40s, 50s, and 60s to really ring the bell. And like, I remember where I was sitting in the conversation you had with me about when you turned 40 and how life was changing and how you wanted to look at your career differently. And you had that conversation with your boss about, this is the time for me to ring the bell. What I want to say in going into this digression or regression is there are times to quit, but there are also times to roll up your sleeves and keep going forward and making sure that you're doing so in a way that is prudent, smart, and will serve you long term. And if you do have the skill set and you're at the right place and you can cultivate your skills, stay. If you're at a bad company that's poorly run, Ian and I've talked about this, go, get the hell out. But if you can have continuity at a certain place and you are being enriched and you are growing, I think that's a time to slow down and look at it and say, does it make sense for me to go? And if you're really, really talented, or if being an entrepreneur is something you ultimately strive to, you're going to have to make that decision at some point, but you don't necessarily need to make it every 12 to 24 months.
I think both of us, we've talked about this. Both of us kind of knew we wanted to leave our last company 4 or 5 years before we actually did it. Yours was smart because you took multiple promotions. I was sort of where I was, I was in the same position those last 3 or 4 years. So I wasn't really growing, that I was stagnating. But if I'd have left even 2 years before, the amount of money I would have left on the table is insane. So for me, there are also times where quitting would just be ignorant. It would just be not even ignorant. It would have been irresponsible for me to leave a few years before when I did, because I owed it to my family to stick around to get the equity payment. I would also say a time not to quit is if you have equity or you have some type of very large bonus that could change your life in a meaningful way, either let you start a business, let you invest different, it's worth it to suck it up sometimes for a few years if you are in a profitable situation, if it'll help you live the next 20 years a lot easier. And for me, I'm very glad that I didn't quit. There were many days where I came home and I was just at my wit's end. I just didn't want to be there. And I sucked it up. I had a glass of wine, had a whiskey, went to bed, got up in the morning, went and grinded more, because I knew if I just keep doing this a few more years, the next 2 decades are going to be amazing. I'll do whatever I want to do and I'll have that kind of flexibility. So you don't want to be obstinate either. If financially it makes sense, there are times where it does make sense to work for money. Forget your passion. If the money is that big, you should stick around for it because it does make your life a lot better.
So I think as we're getting close into wrapping this, there's 2 things I kind of want to go over. Putting things on ice and knowing where you are in a generational cycle. So with what I want to say with putting it on ice is this. There's an article that I read. It was Kenny Chesney, country singer, one of my favorites. And he covered a Bruce Springsteen song 10 or 15 years ago at this point, maybe a little longer. And he and Bruce Springsteen became friends. And one of the things Bruce Springsteen said to him, now Bruce Springsteen's married, children, grown children. One of his children, we talked about the Olympics, was in these past Olympics with Simone Biles. She's very talented on a horse and she does equestrian. But point of the matter is Bruce Springsteen had a family. Kenny Chesney's, a lifelong bachelor. But what Bruce Springsteen said to Kenny Chesney is this: you can write part of a song, you can stick it in a drawer by your bedside, in your bedside table, and it'll still be there for you in 10 years when you come back to it, because your family won't be. And I thought that was incredible. And it was incredible advice, because there are certain parts of our lives that we could stop or mothball or put on ice. And there are certain parts of our lives that we can't. I think people take for granted, I did when I was younger age. As I get into my 40s and now that I have kids, I'm a lot more sensitive to the fact of how old I'll be when my kids are certain ages. But very much so. Like, man, I'll be 60. My kid will only be X. Like that. Like, I hope I'm still fit so I can do fun things. Like those. Like you start thinking about it very differently. But what we trade in a lot of instances is the money, is the job, is the things. We do the anti Garth Brooks or the anti Dave Chappelle, and instead what we do is we just keep grinding. Or we said, you know what, maybe I should pause.
I love that. I love that advice because you've given that to me a few times. I mean, over the last 4 years, I've figured out ways to make money in a lot of different ways. And there are times where I'm doing well with one avenue of revenue and another one I'm frustrated with, and I'll grumble to you. And, you always have great perspective when you talk to me. It's just like, you don't need to be great at all of them all the time. And you don't have time to be great at all of them all the time. And you can always just put it on ice. I always remember you saying that to me, just put it on ice. If that business isn't working well, it'll be there for you in a year, in 2 years. If you want to go back to it, you can always go back to doing something else. If you have a better opportunity right in front of you, you should take advantage of it right now. And you can always come back to that if you're passionate enough about it. But if you're not passionate now, don't ruin the better opportunity to try to do everything. And that advice serves me well all the time, because I feel like I'm always playing a game of arbitrage with my time. Where is my time best served, both personally and from a profitability standpoint? Where can I spend my time best? And that normally means stopping doing something else with my time that is keeping me from doing the most profitable things.
It's funny because I remember not too long ago, people would talk to me about how important time was. And I didn't have money. So I would hear that about time and I'd be like, well, I have to grind for money. Yeah, you do. That's part of it. Like, you don't get to have the discussion about time until you get to a certain spot. Now, if you're in the spot where money is more important to you than time, you should be very critical of where you are spending your time. Because if you're not critical of it, you might be doing things that you shouldn't be doing that aren't going to ultimately get you where you want to go. That's just part of the program, and you need to fully understand that. There's a great movie that came out a decade or so ago with Jim Carrey called Yes Man, and he goes to this seminar and all he can say is yes, yes, yes. Now, he was a no man before. He wouldn't do anything when he get off the couch. He says yes to all this stuff. He ends up in all these incredibly ridiculous situations. And the guy who taught the event was like, you idiot, you don't say yes to everything. You say yes to more because it opens doors. But every time you say yes to something, you close doors to something else. And every time you say no to something, you can open doors to other things that you might be able to say yes to that you can't now. And there's no perfect solution or remedy or scoring sheet. You have to just make these decisions as you go. Steve Jobs had a great quote. He goes, if I look in the mirror more days in a row than I like, and I don't like what I'm doing, I change it. That is what I think we're trying to drive at.
Take us home, Frankie.
So Ian and I were talking about this in prep, and I'm kind of passionate about this. Ian and I are both third generation kids in this country. Ian's parents came from Slovakia. My grandparents came from Italy. And I think knowing where you are in the birth order makes a lot of sense, and you need to be mindful of it. And what we're talking about with discretionary choice with time is something we get to do because where we are. We did not come here from Haiti on a boat. We're not someone whose parents or grandparents speak with an incredibly thick accent because they immigrated here. We get to have choice. Most likely, if you're listening to us, you get to have choice. Our grandparents didn't. Our parents, to most degrees, didn't. And two things have changed: their birth order and the times. The times with the internet and what you're able to do, it's certainly very different. But this dawned on me. So I buy a lot of houses, and I buy houses in all kinds of neighborhoods, but I usually don't buy them in the rich ones. I buy them more in the poor ones. And what I noticed was this: like, I would see all these yard signs, and I would see like urns, and I would see like figurines of Jesus. And I was at my grandmother's house, and she had the same stuff in her yard. And it really made me realize where I was in the birth cycle. And it made me humble and realize maybe there's some luck that plays into this with where I was born. because I get to make these choices. My landscaper speaks with an incredibly thick accent and comes from a shitty part of the world. He's an incredible guy. He doesn't get to make these choices because he's surviving. But most likely, he doesn't listen to this podcast either. If you're listening to this, or if you're in this spot and you're thinking about this, you have great fortune and you get to make decisions. You don't have to.
I love it. I don't have a lot to add to that. I think on that note, it would be a good time to just quit this episode.
I've been done with this since middle school, brother.
You're getting better at rapping all the time. You're doing a very good job. You're closing these things better all the time. I've just stopped doing it. I'll just be the opener. You close.
Perfect.
Frankie, good talking to you, buddy.
Hey, it's a good thing we didn't quit.
Yeah, good thing we didn't quit. I'm glad we did this episode. I hope a few people listen.
See you, brother. Buddy.